Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to do something that it's halfway me kind of setting the record straight, and it's halfway just me reminiscing about something that I have been thinking about a lot lately. I know I've done my whole retrospective on different video game consoles and my like a mega video describing my entire journey with video games. By the way, I'm playing some video games right now while I do this discussion, so bear with me. My concentration is a little divided, plus my cat's on my lap, but I can still talk because this is, as the title implies, a Sega Saturn appreciation video, as well as I'm going to turn the PlayStation off, or the Sega Saturn appreciation video, as much as it is a retrospective. But I got to pull the cat away from the camera because he is vying for my attention right now, so I gotta divide my attention. I have to turn the fan on. It's getting hot in here, so I apologize if this fan's a little loud. I can't do anything else about it other than move it a little bit further away from the microphone and maybe talk a little bit louder. So, in my retrospective journey, I talked about getting a Sega Saturn, and how I repeatedly referred to myself as an idiot for buying a Saturn, and jokingly, I should say, anyone else who bought a Saturn. But I don't mean because there's anything wrong with the Saturn. I bought the Sega Saturn in 2003, which was not a full decade after it had crashed and burned, but enough time that, because it had failed so tremendously, because it did, the software sales were never massive in its heyday, which meant in the aftermarket, when I was buying Saturn games and accessories and consoles, they were already rare and elevated price at that time. I dare not even wonder what they are today. And so in 2003, 2004, 2005, the 3 years that I had a Sega Saturn, and then I finally gave up on attempting to buy quality games for it because it was expensive, and the games were rare, so I was having a hard time finding them outside of eBay, which, again, they were elevated price on eBay, and I was, not interested in that. So I was getting disillusioned with trying to collect for the Sega Saturn. But I want to backtrack a little bit and do an overall retrospective, because my personal experiences are not going to be reflective of the average Sega gamer at the time, nor yours most likely. But I do want to point out that prior to the release of the Saturn, back when I just had a Genesis, and the 32X was the thing it was announced and it was getting ready to release in the U.S. The Saturn was released in Japan at the same time as the 32X in the U.S., so I was aware of, because I was reading the magazines at the time, Sega Visions, Electronic Gaming Monthly, Game Pro, and a few others. Not Nintendo Power, but that's just because I wasn't as into Nintendo. I was more into Sega. It wasn't anything else. It was just, I just didn't have an interest in it. But I was reading other magazines at the time, and they were all talking about the upcoming, next generation. The 3DO had just launched, the Jaguar had just launched, the 32X had just launched, the Saturn and PlayStation were out in Japan, but not in North America, where I lived at the time yet. And so there was no, there was no like consensus of which one of these is going to be the next big thing. And so I was equally interested in the 3DO, the 32X, and the Saturn. I had zero interest in, like, none in the Jaguar. I had an Atari as a kid. I was over it. By the mid-90s, I had moved on. Atari was in my rearview mirror, and I had, like, smudged it with peanut butter and didn't look in the mirror anymore because I was, like, not interested. So I had zero interest in the Jaguar. When it was announced, when it was released, when it was on sale, when it was discontinued, and then when it became aftermarket, my interest in the Jaguar never changed. PlayStation, my initial gut reaction to PlayStation was, that'll never work. Sega's too strong, Nintendo's too powerful. These other companies are coming out, 3DO and other companies, I can't remember all of them at the time. CDI was floundering, Neo Geo was doing its thing. But I just remember thinking, I don't know any of these games. PlayStation didn't have name brand games that they were talking about in the magazines. It was all new stuff that I'd never heard of, like Wipeout and Battle Arena Toshinden and stuff like that. These were not games that I had played. These were not games that were sequels to franchises that I already had experience with, like Sega had and Nintendo had. These were not games that were, well, in the case of Battle Arena they were, but they weren't necessarily games that were coming from the arcade that I played, like Sega had, with Virtua Fighter and, other games of the time, Virtua Racing, Virtua Cop, games like that, or games in long-running franchises like Shinobi, Streets of Rage, Golden Axe, Phantasy Star, Sonic. Did I say Sonic? Yeah, Sonic. And other stuff. So my initial reaction was Sony's going to have a real hard time getting people to buy their no-name games when name brand games are on they're going to be on the Saturn and 32X. And eventually, whenever it comes out, the Project Reality, which I was also very, very interested in, all the way up until I got one. And then I've told that story, so we don't need to rehash it. But needless to say, I never became a die-hard N64 fan. Likewise, I never really became a die-hard Saturn fan. But I want to tell the whole story. Not Sega's story, necessarily, because everybody's done that. I want to tell my experience, but I want to use that as a lens that other people can look at what a diehard Sega gamer of the era was thinking about the Saturn, and why even somebody that was the target demographic that should have saved up money to buy a Saturn and should have wanted it, ended up getting an N64 and a PlayStation instead. And I've told this story. I got my N64 and my PlayStation on the same day, on my 18th birthday. And notice I didn't say Saturn or Dreamcast, even though they were both out at the time. I've already talked about that. But before I got to that point, before it came to America, before there was the E3 debacle and the rushed surprise bullshit launch that fucked up Saturn's hopes and dreams, I was still anticipating the Saturn coming out and getting very excited for that to be the next, the entry point in the next gen. Now, 32X had just come out, and I was already wanting one based entirely on Mortal Kombat 2. That's it. I already had Mortal Kombat 2 on the Genesis. Loved it, by the way. I had no issues with it. I had minor nitpicks, yeah, but I was still satisfied with the game. But I knew Mortal Kombat 2 on the 32X was supposed to be better. I would discover years later, when I finally got a 32X and that game, it was not significantly better enough. And so I am glad I didn't buy a 32X at the time for that game, because I surely would have been disappointed in 94, 95 had I got a 32X with that game at the time. I would have been disappointed because it was not enough better than the Genesis version that it would have satisfied me. It just wasn't. But I remember reading about the Saturn, and there were a few things that had me interested. One was the arcade games, obviously. I'm into fighting games, especially at this time. But you have to remember, in 94, 95, 96, the years that the Saturn were actively trying to convince people to buy it, there was a shift in arcade fighting games. And that shift was primarily two places. Number one, we were moving away from, moving away from cel-shaded, computer-animated, 2D, sprite-based fighting games. Street Fighter, King of Fighters, digitized but still 2D animated, Mortal Kombat, etc. And we were migrating towards this new 3D era. You had the proto 3D games like Primal Rage and Killer Instinct that used illusions and trickery like Donkey Kong Country did to give us almost 3D, but not quite 3D. And then you had the primitive, true 3D games like Virtua Fighter, and then Virtua Fighter 2, and then you had, like I mentioned, Battle Arena Toshinden, and you had a few other primitive ones like the first Tekken, Soul Blade, and a few others that were out there. Eventually we would get Soul Calibur, but that's another story for another day. And so that focus on the transition to 3D fighting games was the area I was disinterested. I had played Virtua Fighter in the arcade, and I had seen some of these other 3D fighting games, and I couldn't tell you which ones they were today, but I remember like seeing them, going to the arcade and seeing them, and walking past them not interested because they all looked like Virtua Fighter. They looked like ass, dog shit. Those primitive early 3D fighting games just didn't play well, and they didn't look good. It was hot, shiny, new tech demo, here's the future, but it didn't deliver yet. Now, they would advance rapidly. The leap from Virtua Fighter to Virtua Fighter 2 is astronomical. Then by the time we get to Tekken 3, and I've already mentioned it, but later Soul Blade and Soul Calibur, 3D fighting games had a foothold. But those early primitive 3D fighting games did nothing for me. And because that was one of the launch titles that they were using to push the 32X and the Sega Saturn, that aspect of it had me iffy. Like I said, I wanted a 32X for Mortal Kombat 2. I wasn't interested in Virtua Fighter, even though that was the other flagship launch title at the time. That wasn't the game I was going to buy a 32X to play, or had I bought a 32X. I wasn't interested in that game. I wouldn't have bought it anyways. I was still interested in 3D games. I had played Star Fox at a friend's house. I had sampled Donkey Kong Country at a Sears kiosk. I had played, Virtua Racing, and I saw the magazine ads for that that Star Wars arcade game. And there were some proto 3D games on the Super Nintendo that I got to play at a friend's house, Mario Kart, F-Zero, and then there were a few others like, Killer Instinct, Primal Rage was kind of pseudo proto 3D, or at least it was textured to look kind of like the 3D games, like Killer Instinct, even though it wasn't. It was like, it was that illusion that they were selling us at the time as we were trying to get proper 3D games caught up to speed. And then there were other things like Doom on the PC, Wolfenstein, Heretic, Descent, MechWarrior 2, Duke Nukem 3D. These were all games I was playing on computers, again, at friends' houses, at school, in just different various places. So I had a concept of what, at the time, modern cutting-edge 3D video games could look like and could play like. And they weren't all garbage 3D fighters that I was seeing in the arcade. Racing games, I will, if I have a console and I'm on my, 7th or 8th, purchase, I might start looking at a racing. That's when I'm going to start looking at racing titles. If I'm on my first, handful, my first half dozen purchases, no, racing games are not going to sell me on a game console. Never. I'm not somebody that's, oh my god, I got to get the new Daytona or the new Need for Speed or whatever. Not interested. Just the same reason why having a fuck ton of 3D racing games on the N64, well, that didn't translate to my fucking interest in the N64. That's not what I was looking for. Sports games, I've never been interested in, so I didn't give two flying fucks that the Saturn was going to have good, allegedly, 3D sports games. I wasn't interested. I wasn't going to buy them. I wasn't going to play them, so those were not on my radar. I already had zero interest in the 3D fighting games that would eventually develop over time, but at the time, I had no interest in them. In fact, I had an aversion to them. I thought they looked ugly and they didn't play great, and so I was just like, these suck. I don't want these. Maybe when they get better, I'll take another look, which I did when I got Tekken 3. That was one of the first games I bought with my original PlayStation. And I loved Tekken 3, by the way. That was like, okay, we finally figured out how to make a good 3D fighting game. And later, when I got a Saturn and I picked up Fighting Vipers, Fighters Megamix, and Virtua Fighter 2, I learned that, oh yeah, Virtua Fighter 2, which was the immediate sequel to Virtua Fighter, was a quality fighting game. But that first Virtua Fighter was so goddamn primitive and ugly and played like ass that I had zero interest in it. Asterisk, this was my feelings at the time. I want to make that clear. My views on all of this have evolved and changed over time, which is the purpose of this retrospective. And then there were the franchise games, the heavy hitters that were supposed to sell me and you and everybody else on the Saturn. Sonic the Hedgehog, Shinobi, Golden Axe, Streets of Rage, Toe Jam and Earl. They were no-shows. We eventually got a Golden Axe game on the Saturn, Golden Axe The Duel, which was not a quality representation of the arcade gameplay that Golden Axe gamers wanted. We never got Eternal Champions. We barely got a Sonic the Hedgehog game that I really have to talk about because I have a story that goes with it. We got a Shinobi game that really did not look any better than the Genesis games, honestly. It was like, okay, yeah, some more animations and detail and vibrant colors and whatnot, but it could have been a Super Nintendo game or a Sega CD game, and no one would have been the wiser. Those games didn't exist. There was no Toe Jam and Earl. There was no Streets of Rage. So all of the heavy hitters that we expected to be on the Saturn never showed up. Instead, they gave us new games that were head-scratchers at the time. The first one was their, I'm going to say pseudo 3D platformer. Some people say 2.5D. I have an allergic reaction to that phrase, so I don't like to use it. So I'll say pseudo 3D, because it's like Donkey Kong Country. It uses 3D rendered models to make the characters and 3D rendered backgrounds, but it's in a 2D plane. But it does rotate one 2D plane to another. So it's like this. It goes, and that's what it does. Not as 3D as Crash Bandicoot on the PlayStation, but slightly, maybe 2% more 3D than Donkey Kong Country and its sequels on the Super Nintendo. So, pseudo 3D, you know. But, unlike Donkey Kong Country, where they would render the 3D graphics on a powerful computer, and then take a screenshot of it, and then use that as a reference to make a sprite based on the 3D image, they were using actual 3D rendering on the Saturn. So, Clockwork Knight has a similar look to Donkey Kong Country. It's actual hardware rendered polygons with cell shading and texture mapping to make it look better. If you play Clockwork Knight, like you watch it in motion side by side with Donkey Kong Country, it looks better. It's got more depth, more colors, more animation, it's more vibrant, and it's got more detail. And I want to repeat, it has more depth. It's not an illusion like Donkey Kong Country is on Super Nintendo. It's an actual 3D world that you explore on a 2D plane. Very similar to Yoshi's Story on the N64 or Beautiful Joe on the PS2 and the GameCube. So it's that kind of situation where it is a 3D game, but it's played on a 2D plane. Like Smash Brothers. Most people are familiar with Smash Brothers. But it does rotate. But it only rotates at certain points. But there is some interaction with the backgrounds. And that was Sega's attempt at, their first attempt at a 3D style platformer. Remember, Mario 64 hadn't happened yet. Crash Bandicoot hadn't happened yet. Bubsy 3D that we all shit on and love to hate hadn't even happened yet. Klonoa hadn't happened. This was, I don't know if this was the first 3D platformer, but it was certainly early in the genre. But I was still interested in it, even though it looked weird. I still wanted to play it because I love platformers. And I like Sonic, I like Mario, I liked ToeJam and Earl, Tempo, you know, on the 32X. There were too many fucking platformers for me to list. I loved 2D platformers. Gex was one that I got on the 3DO, emulated on the 3DO, but got on the Saturn and PlayStation eventually. And yes, it was one, when I did eventually get a Saturn, Gex was one of the games I bought for it. Because I still love those 2D platformers. So, unlike the fighting games, Clockwork Knight and the other 3D platformer that was coming out at the time, Bug, which I'll talk about, Bug with an exclamation point. So, Bug, if you will, I guess. Still piqued my interest because they had the gameplay I was expecting from that type of game. And they still looked slightly better. Although, I have to admit, only marginally better than the 3D fighting games we were seeing in the arcade at the time. And that's because the Saturn had CD-ROM technology. They could do, like, pre-rendered backgrounds. And the Saturn was technically more powerful than the Model 1 and Model 2 arcade boards that Sega was pushing their 3D arcade games on at the time. The Saturn is essentially based on the Model 2. And when I say more powerful, that's primarily because it's got some bells and whistles that the arcade board doesn't have. Even though the arcade board has stronger, like, polygon capabilities, yes. But it also has the CD-ROM, which allows it to do things that you can't do in an arcade on a ROM chip. So it is still technically more powerful or more capable than the arcade board, even if the arcade board can push more raw polygons. It doesn't matter. It's not matter how many polygons can your system push. It's what you can do with them. And the Saturn could do more with those polygons than the Model 1 and the Model 2 arcade boards could. Because it had the advantage of pre-rendered capabilities, FMVs and pre-rendered backgrounds and other, weather effects and things like that you could do on the Saturn that you couldn't easily do in an arcade. So those platformers still look slightly better than and I say slightly, than those early 3D arcade games, fighting games. And I say slightly because when you play a Clockwork Knight on a CRT, on an actual Saturn hardware with a Saturn controller, and you see it in action, it does look impressive enough, for that type of game. Absolutely. But side by side with like Toy Story or any of the 3 Donkey Kong Country games on the SNES, or even Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island on the Super Nintendo, or even Gex on the other 32-bit systems, or Rayman on the Jaguar, it doesn't stand out at all. It's just another platformer of that style. And because the game was rushed, it was released in 2 parts. They basically cut the game in half and released the first half of the game as Clockwork Knight and the second half of the game as Clockwork Knight 2, effectively being essentially not identical, but more or less the equivalent of DLC, paid DLC. You had to purchase the other half of the game. That was something that magazines talked about and gamers talked about because it was a short fucking game, and it was very obvious if you played Clockwork Knight that, oh yeah, this is not the whole fucking game. And when you got Clockwork Knight 2, it was like, yep, this is the rest of the game. Now, they tried to cover this up using like FMVs and this in-game story and stuff to pad the game to make it feel like you were getting bang for your buck, but you were not. And so that was a disappointment. And a lot of people either experienced it firsthand and were disappointed, or heard about it through the grapevine or read about it in the magazines, and that would have been a reason to go, maybe I should wait on this Saturn thing and see where it goes. Then you had the aforementioned bug. Now this one is also a 3D rendered game that moves on a 2D plane. However, it is slightly more 3D, and only slightly more 3D than a Clockwork Knight, because the 2D plane is similar but not identical to Crash Bandicoot in that you have you're following the character front to back, on a path, on a linear path. You can't move side to side like you can on Crash Bandicoot, so it's straight. It's basically like you're running away from the camera towards the horizon, kind of like you would in Crash Bandicoot, but you can't move side to side and you can't rotate. There's no 3D movement. Or you can rotate and move side to side on a 2D plane, but again, it's just 2D movement. So it creates a slightly more 3D illusion than Clockwork Knight does, and it almost feels like a proper 3D game, even though it isn't. It's more of a 3D game than Clockwork Knight, and likewise, I'll mention it again, Donkey Kong Country, but still not as much of a 3D game as Crash Bandicoot, which is the same thing. Some levels you're moving, front to back, and other levels you're moving side to side, but you're still moving mostly on a 2D plane in Crash Bandicoot, but you have a little side-to-side movement in a semi-3D space, although it's not full 3D. If you've ever played Crash Bandicoot, you kind of know what I'm talking about. It's not fully 3D like Super Mario 64 and later Rareware platformers on the N64 would be. Like Banjo-Kazooie or Conker's Bad Fur Day, etc. So it was still primitive, but it looked impressive at the time, and it came with, you know, FMVs on the disc and pre-rendered backgrounds to kind of, again, create the illusion of a more 3D environment than it really was. However, because it was moving in a 3D space, even though you were on a line, the polygons were still moving in a 3D space. There was no rotation, but it was still going like this in a 3D space, moving away from you. But the character wasn't like, the environments were moving towards you. The character was staying put. So it created the illusion of moving in a 3D space. But the environments, which were rendered in 3D, were moving towards you. You had 3D objects coming towards you. And because, it was rushed, and the hardware was complicated to develop, and Sega didn't take the time to do it right, there was a lot of pop-up in the game, and a lot of really terrible draw distances that made it hard to navigate these worlds, because you had to switch from left to right, front to back, all throughout the level. It was sort of like a maze. So it wasn't like Crash Bandicoot where you had front to back levels, and then you switched to a side-to-side level. You would switch in level, kind of like you had in Clockwork Knight with that rotation, but it didn't rotate. You just sort of moved along a predefined path. Bug had very primitive movements. He could basically run and climb and jump, and that was about it. So, you know, he didn't have an attack. Let me rephrase that. A unique attack, like Clockwork Knight did, but the Clockwork Knight attack was, well, useless in the game overall. As much as I liked talking about Clockwork Knight, and it looked good, and at the time I was interested in it, once you sit down and play the game, is where it falls apart. Gameplay, no. Clockwork Knight, not fun at all. Bug, you know, I would say on a scale of like 1 to 100%, Clockwork Knight is like 20% playable as a video game, and the other 80% is just tech demo, and not impressive tech demo. Bug is 50-50. It's a 50% playable game and 50% tech demo. And again, not a good tech demo because of the pop-up and everything. And the obnoxious voice samples, which was popular at the time. You know, Gex had them, and other 3D other platformers at the time had them. So that was just a thing you had to put up with. But it was obnoxious. You could turn the voice samples off, if I remember correctly, or just mute the fucking TV. So that was a thing you could do. But from what I remember, and this is just going off of memory, I haven't played either of these games recently, but what I remember is the music was nothing special. I don't remember any of the music sticking. I can still hear the Virtua Cop theme in my head. I can, like, close my eyes and, like, yeah, that's Virtua Cop. We'll get there. That goes back to the arcade experience that the Saturn was also trying to emulate, while at the same time trying to bring these new experiences that we were expecting from next-gen systems that PlayStation was promising, N64 was promising, 3DO and Jaguar were not promising because they couldn't, but they were, you know, there was an expectation that they would do those things, but they couldn't. And so, yeah. The 3DO was just a glorified Sega CD with like 32x level of 3D capabilities. And the Jaguar is just the 32x without anything that makes the 32x special. So there you go. But anyways, getting back to the Saturn. The other games that were shown off at the time that caught my attention were Panzer Dragoon, which I did eventually get, and the aforementioned Virtua Cop. Virtua Racing was the entire reason that the 32X existed, not because it was a launch title, but because they couldn't make it work on the Genesis, even though they tried to mimic Nintendo's Super FX chip method by creating the SVP chip, Sega Virtual Processor. And they tried to bring Virtua Racing to the Genesis via putting a chip in the cartridge to give it 3D capabilities. It didn't work well. So then they had to create the 32X and launch the 32X with Virtua Racing Deluxe. So that was like the game that they were pushing on the 32X. That game did eventually come to the Saturn. It was very confusingly missing at launch. Now, Daytona USA would come out, which was a decidedly better 3D racing game. And you would also you eventually would get Virtua Racing, but by the time it came out on the Saturn, it was no longer impressive. And then, like I said, you had Virtua Fighter, which the launch version of Virtua Fighter sucked, because it was like a buggy, incomplete port of the 32X game, essentially. And then it later got fixed with Virtua Fighter Remix. And then Virtua Fighter 2. By the time Virtua Fighter 2 came out, but again, we're getting ahead of ourselves, they worked out all the bugs. But initially, that didn't look good. And then you had Panzer Dragoon, and then you also had Virtua Cop. And again, these aren't all I'm not saying games that were available at launch. I'm talking about the games that they were talking about ahead of launch. So these were games that would have been available right at launch or very nearly after, once they were finished. So don't come at me in the comments, that wasn't a launch title. I'm not being, like, specific, like, ooh, these were the... Because I didn't buy the thing at launch. I was just going by what I was reading about in the magazines, and then what I picked up later when I actually got a Saturn. Because, by the way, this whole time, I had friends who had Genesis. I had one friend who had a Jaguar. Friends with Super Nintendo. I had a friend with a Sega CD. I had friends with PlayStation. I had friends with N64. I had a couple of friends that got a Dreamcast. I never knew a single person ever in my real life offline circle who ever had a Sega Saturn. Not one. So I know they were rare at the time because nobody I knew had one. And I also knew they were rare at the time I started collecting them because still nobody I knew was collecting them. In fact, even though I was the most hardcore of my gamer friends, even my other gamer collector friends who had PlayStation and Genesis and Sega CD and NES and Atari weren't interested in collecting for the Saturn. I encountered more people that either had or had expressed interest at various points in Sega CD than I ever did anyone who either had or expressed interest in a Saturn. Even though by the numbers, Saturn was overall more successful than the Sega CD. I think the Sega CD had initial hype going for it that the Saturn didn't necessarily have. Because the PlayStation stole all their hype, and the 32X made people scratch their heads and go, wait a minute, what's going on here? So by the time the Saturn hit its stride, it was too late. Gamers had moved on, companies had moved on, retailers had moved on, the market moved on. And Sega never recovered. But after that initial batch of magazine articles comparing the launches of the PlayStation and the Saturn and their holiday guides, in '95, their holiday guides, which next-gen system should you buy? From what I remember, the general consensus was, if you're going to buy a 32-bit system, buy the PlayStation. Your odds are better that you'll find something to play on it than you will on the Saturn. Or, if you don't mind waiting a few months, just hold out for the we expect to be better Project Reality or Ultra 64 or later Nintendo 64. That's what most magazines were. The arguments they were making is the Saturn just ain't worth it. Either wait for an N64 or just get a PlayStation. You'll be better off either way. Now, as Saturn went on, I stopped seeing commercials for it. None of my friends were talking about it. And I hadn't even seen any games in stores. So, by the time I finally got around to having the money and deciding I wanted to buy a Saturn, they had already been clearanced out of the stores. And the pawn shops in my local area weren't even taking them in. They were like, nah, we're not interested. We lost our ass on the Game Gear. We lost our ass on the 32X. We lost our ass on the Sega CD. We're not fucking with this Saturn thing. And they wouldn't even bother with the Dreamcast when it came out. So a lot of the second-hand stores in the town I lived at the time didn't even carry, they wouldn't even take in Saturn or Dreamcast product when those things first hit the aftermarket. Because they were like, no, we can't give that shit away. And so initially, there was no aftermarket interest in the Saturn. Just like there was initially no viable active gamer market in the Saturn at the time. Now, if you just glance at Wikipedia, you'll be like, well, they sold, almost 9 million units in the span of 3.5 years. No, they sold half of those units in Japan, and the other half in the rest of the world. And by the way, it had 2 more years in Japan than it had in the rest of the world. 1 more year head start, and it lasted 1 more year in Japan after it had been discontinued everywhere else. So the Saturn's lifespan, you can't just look at the Wikipedia start and stop dates and be like, oh, that's how it, no, that's not how it goes. If you lived in North America, the thing barely sold better than the Sega CD worldwide, which the bulk of Sega CD sales were in North America. So even though worldwide total, more people had a Saturn than a Sega CD, in the US, more people more likely had a Sega CD than a Sega Saturn. So, put that into perspective. You have to break things down by region. So, what that means is, a lot of the late Saturn games, I didn't read about in the magazines, because the magazines had already stopped covering the Saturn by that time. They would occasionally be like, here's a list of games coming out, but they weren't doing in-depth coverage. Panzer Dragoon Saga never got in-depth preview coverage in the magazines that I read. Or at least I don't remember it. It may have got passive mention, but nobody was, excited for Panzer Dragoon Saga. People were too busy hyping Final Fantasy VII to even pay attention to Panzer Dragoon Saga, which is why the game only sold 500,000 units in North America. Which is why it's an outrageously expensive piece of shit today. By the way, I have played Panzer Dragoon Saga. It is an overpriced, underwhelming piece of shit. It's not a terrible game, but it is not... if it had been given a big marketing push, it was not the system seller that was going to save the Saturn. And I'll tell you what, it can't lick the toe jam off of Final Fantasy VII's toes, okay? They're not in the same league. Final Fantasy VII is God tier, and Panzer Dragoon Saga is, maggots in the toilet tier. If you're just going to compare. That doesn't mean it's a bad game. It just means that compared to the system seller, everybody bought a PlayStation to play, it is a bad game. Because we were told, don't buy Final Fantasy VII or a PlayStation, get Panzer Dragoon Saga instead. And if you fell for that, well, I'm sincerely sorry. I feel sorry for you, because it's not, you're missing out. If you drank the Kool-Aid and you bought Panzer Dragoon Saga expecting it to be as good as Final Fantasy VII, you were disappointed. Now, there was also Mystara, which goes by another name, and that's another thing we don't need to talk about. But the rest of the Saturn library was a hodgepodge of quote-unquote original bullshit made for the Saturn, which some of it was good, some of it was almost good, and a lot of it was just garbage. Incomplete, buggy, didn't play well, didn't look good, never felt like it got the attention it deserved. Now, the 2D games that came out on the Saturn, that's a different story. Every 2D game that came out on the Saturn felt like a labor of love. Like, yeah, if you're into 2D games, the Saturn is your box. But if you really want those proper 3D experiences, the Saturn will give you a taste. Yes, there is Tomb Raider 1 on the Saturn, and Resident Evil 1 on the Saturn, and Wipeout, and a handful of big multi-platform games made it to the Saturn. A handful. But and then there's a handful of questionable quality exclusives, and air quotes exclusives, because some of them had mind-boggling last-gen ports. Genesis 32X, Sega CD ports, like Corpse Killer, or the previously mentioned Sonic 3D Blast, which I'm going to have to do a separate video on its own, because the absence of a proper Sonic game on the Sega Saturn is a much debated topic. But the fact that Sonic 3D Blast was originally intended to be a 32X game, but then they moved it over to the Saturn because they were desperate and needed a game on the Saturn, but then they realized that the 32X was dead in the water, so then they stripped it down and somehow shoved it on the Genesis, is a weird story, because they were also working on Sonic Extreme, which, from what we know, what we've seen, the prototypes and the screenshots and the videos and everything else, game was not going to save the Saturn either. That game, if it had come out, y'all, I hear it all the time, oh, if Sonic Extreme had just come out on the Saturn, things would have been different. No, it wouldn't. It just would have been another game sitting on your bookshelf that you paid $600 for collecting dust. Okay? Everything we have seen of Sonic Extreme, the assets that were repurposed into Sonic R, the stuff that would eventually get reused for Sonic Jam, the stuff that would get recycled and enhanced for Sonic Adventure, the stuff that we've seen in magazines, and, you know, all of this. If you take it all and you piece together, you know, the tech demos and the videos that were shown off, no, that game was not going to be a quality game, okay? We know this. It would have been no better than Sonic 3D Blast. And I say that because I like Sonic 3D Blast, especially the Saturn version. The Genesis version does suck. I am one of those people that I really wish the game had been and stayed a 32X exclusive, because at least then the game would have been, you know, relevant to the platform. You know, on the Genesis, it sucks because the Genesis can't handle it, so they have to take out everything that makes it good in the first place, and it sucks on the Saturn even though it doesn't, because it's just not up to snuff. It's like, well, this doesn't look like a Saturn game. And it doesn't. It looks like it should have been a 32X game. Now, I will say, had Sonic 3D Blast been a 32X exclusive, that might have changed things for the 32X. But we'll never know. And I'm not going to rubber stamp that as a definitive, sure, that's my stance. I'm just saying it could have at least sold a few more 32X hardware units and maybe some software sales. I don't know. But it definitely would have been better received on the 32X than it was on the Saturn. because it looks primitive and out of place on the Saturn, and it looks like ass on the Genesis because it has no business being on the Genesis, because the Genesis can't fucking run it doesn't have the hardware to run it. So that's a mind-boggling, asinine thing Sega did. And then you have stuff like them showing off Eternal Champions and then never releasing it. You have the Shinobi Legions, or whatever it's called, that looks like it could have been a Sega CD game. Doesn't look like it needed to be on the Saturn. You have Mr. Bones, which is way overhyped for what it is. Unique, sure, I'll give you that. Fun? No, not even a little fun, okay? Looks amazing. I'll give you that. But when you act, and there's a lot of Saturn games that get a lot of buzz on YouTube, right? Saturn gamers will say, here's a hidden gem on the Saturn. And they'll talk great things about this game, and you'll be like, oh, that looks impressive, because they cherry pick the parts they're showing you in the videos. But when you sit down to play the game, you're like, no, thank you. This isn't impressive at all. And unfortunately, that's the case with Panzer Dragoon Saga, Mystara, Mr. Bones, Burning Rangers. A lot of these hidden gems that were technically, in one capacity or another, Saturn exclusives, that just, you know, if the only system that existed in 1995, 1996 was the Saturn, these would have been perfectly acceptable games. But when you have to, you fuck off if you do not accept this. You have to compare them to what was also available on the PlayStation at the same time. Because you can't just lock the Saturn in a box and say, here's what its games look like. See, aren't they impressive? Well, in a vacuum that nothing else exists in, maybe. But when you compare any of those games to Bug Riders on the PlayStation, Vigilante 8 on the PlayStation, Spyro the Dragon, Crash Bandicoot, and I'm intentionally picking out games that aren't well known or even great games, because even mediocre, middle of the road games that nobody's ever heard of on the PlayStation still looked and played better than these so-called hidden gems on the Saturn. And God forbid, if you ever got a multi-platform game, which was very rare, Tomb Raider, Resident Evil, Battle Arena Tau Shinden had a version, Wipeout had a version on the Saturn. I don't think there's that many other proper 3D games that did get Saturn conversions. Maybe, probably do. I'll say probably do. I don't know for sure, but I would be surprised if it didn't, but I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't as well. I would be like, okay, sure, I guess not, but probably do. When you look at those games, functionally they look similar enough most of the time to their direct PlayStation counterparts. Resident Evil 1 on the Saturn, Resident Evil 1 on the PlayStation, Tomb Raider 1 on the Saturn, Tomb Raider 1 on the PlayStation. Yeah, they're comparable. But, again, you have to lock it in a vacuum and go like, see, Resident Evil is just as good on the Saturn, so blah, blah, blah. Okay, but show me Resident Evil 2 on the Saturn. Oh, you can't. Show me Tomb Raider 2, Tomb Raider 3, Grand Theft Auto. Show me fucking Metal Gear Solid, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, the previously mentioned multiple times Soul Blade, or Tekken. You can't, because they don't fucking exist. So yeah, you can get a one game on the Saturn in a specific game type. And I think Die Hard Arcade had a Saturn version. But like, you can get like Daytona USA, there's your 3D racing game. Okay, your one 3D racing game. The rest of them are on the N64 or the PlayStation. Sure, you can get your one Tomb Raider game. That's your one 3D action-adventure cinematic game on the Saturn. That's it. There are no others. There's none. That's the one you get, And you can get that game on PlayStation. You don't have to buy a Saturn to get it. And so that was my frustration with Saturn, is when I started collecting, it was like, yeah, yes, Saturn does have Tomb Raider. But I had Tomb Raider on the PlayStation, and I paid like $7.99 for it at a GameStop. You don't want to know how much I paid for Tomb Raider on the Sega Saturn once I took it home, powered it on, and realized that, oh, it's nothing special, it's just Tomb Raider. At the time, I was actively collecting Sega Saturn games. If I came across one, whether it was an exclusive or a multi-platform, it didn't matter. It would be 2, 3, or even 4 times as much as its PlayStation counterpart. Either exact port on the PlayStation, Tomb Raider, Resident Evil, etc., or that type of game on the PlayStation. You had Panzer Dragoon on the Saturn. You had Bug Riders on the PlayStation, which isn't the same type of game, but it looks comparable graphically. Although Bug Riders is more of a racing game, and Panzer Dragoon is more of an on-rails shooter. You could just go get Star Fox 64 and have a better time. But then you start looking at, like, yeah, Mystara, it's fine, it's decent. It's not as good as Breath of Fire, what one was it, 4 on the Saturn, or PlayStation? It's not as good as Legend of Dragoon, it's not as good as any of the Tales games on the PlayStation. It sure as hell isn't as good as any of the Final Fantasies on the PlayStation, and it's not even as good as Chrono Cross on the PlayStation. So, the best 3D RPG you can get, which, by the way, Mystara is a quality game, leagues better than Panzer Dragoon Saga. The best 3D RPG you can get on the Saturn, which is Mystara, is a mediocre game if it were on the PlayStation. And that's the test. Pretend that the Saturn doesn't exist and just ask yourself, if this was a PlayStation game, would I still be interested in this game? No. 9 times out of 10, the answer is no. And that's the problem I have with Saturn. I love Sega, but I go back to the Saturn and I have an appreciation for what it did, or, excuse me, what it tried to do. Because what it did was killed Sega and kicked them out of the hardware business. The home console business, I should say. Because it didn't leave them in good shape to launch the Dreamcast, which was their, the nail in the coffin. But if the Saturn hadn't been as big of a failure as it was, the Dreamcast still would have failed, but it might have had more games. I don't know. Also, the fact that there were roughly 250 games released for the Sega Saturn in North America doesn't bode well, because that's nothing. That's fucking nothing. It's better than what the Master System got in North America, and roughly comparable to what the Dreamcast got, and not far from what ultimately the N64 got at 297 games. But god damn it, nothing on the Sega Saturn. Not even Nights into Dreams, which is the crowning achievement of the Sega Saturn, and by far the best game on the system. Not even Nights into Dreams, which is an actual good game, by the way. And I didn't even pay that much for it because I got it at a thrift store. Actually, I got lucky. It's not even as good as any of the games on the N64 in that genre. Conkers, Banjo, Donkey Kong, Mario, etc. It's not even as good. I'm going to be up front with you. It's not even as good as Kirby 64 or even Yoshi's, whatever the fuck it's called, because those Yoshi games aren't that great anyways. It's just, it's the best game you're going to get on the Saturn, and it's a middle-of-the-road game at best. Now, none of that I just said applies to 2D games. The Saturn is a fucking beast when it comes to 2D, except for the fact that only a handful of 2D games that are amazing are still exclusive to the Saturn. Most of the best 2D games that Saturn gamers are going to say, this is why you buy a Saturn, well, they've already got comparable, and in some cases, superior ports on the PlayStation, or even the Dreamcast, or in some cases, Neo Geo, 3DO, Sega CD, etc. There's no justifiable reason to own a Saturn unless you A, had one as a kid and you have nostalgia for it, or B, you're a diehard Sega nerd that just has to have it because you just do, or C, you're the collector that buys everything. Everyone else would be better off getting a PlayStation and or an N64. And I would argue and an N64, because how are you going to live without a PlayStation? And yes, you can get Castlevania Symphony of the Night and Mega Man 8 on the Saturn. And they're fine ports, but okay, you got one Castlevania game. What about the others? You got one Mega Man game. What about the others? That's all I have to say. I wanted to like the Saturn, but as time went on, I just couldn't. And looking back on it today, I have even less of an interest in the Saturn today because I don't want to pay $199 for Mortal Kombat Trilogy when I can pay $6 for it on the PlayStation. The exact same fucking game.